The morning Kira came back to him, the sky split open. Thomas Dunn stood in the kitchen, still holding the test strip, the two pink lines vivid as a wound. Mandy was laughing. Actually laughing. The real kind. The kind he hadn't heard in 14 months. And he was trying to match it. But his throat had closed over, and the best he could manage was a breath that turned into something close to a sob. And she pulled him in, and they stood there in the gray Birmingham morning, with their foreheads pressed together, and the kettle going cold behind them. He almost didn't hear the alarm. It started as a low-frequency thing, more felt than heard, like the building settling. Then every phone in the house lit up simultaneously. Then the window glass hummed. Thomas moved to the curtain and pulled it and saw his neighbor, old Arthur Mack, standing in his driveway in his bathrobe, looking straight up, mouth open, and above Arthur, above the terraced rooftops and the November sky, something was blotting out the clouds, something the size of a county. By noon, there were 17 of them over the British Isles alone. The visions came first. That was how they worked. That was what nobody understood until too late. Bombs, not lasers, visions. Every human being on Earth, at 11:42 GMT, received approximately 4 seconds of direct neurological contact. 4 seconds of something that was not quite sight, and not quite sound, and not quite feeling, but was all three at once, raw and enormous. A transmission from a mind that thought in geometries humans had no names for. Most people describe it later as standing at the edge of something infinite and being told with absolute certainty that they were not significant enough to be destroyed, that they were simply in the way. The official term, coined by a researcher at Cambridge before the university stopped broadcasting, was the diminishment. Thomas found Mandy in the hallway, sitting against the wall with her knees drawn up. She was fine. Physically fine. But she was staring at nothing with the expression he recognized from his worst patients. The ones who had been shown something the mind refused to accept. He sat beside her on the floor and took her hand, and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be inadequate. Outside, Birmingham was beginning to burn. He got them moving. That was the first thing Thomas Dunn was good at. Getting people moving when they'd stopped. 14 months of grief had taught him that freezing was the luxury, and they couldn't afford it. Packed what mattered. Medication, the pregnancy vitamins, water, the photo of Rebecca from the mantelpiece. He didn't think about why he took the photo. He just took it. The roads were clogged within 30 minutes of the first strikes. Ships. They were calling them harrows in the news reports that still crackled through on Thomas's radio. Named for their shape, long and tapered and curved like an agricultural blade. Didn't target infrastructure first. They targeted gatherings, crowds. Anything that looked, from altitude, like organized resistance. The algorithms they used, if algorithms was even the right word, seemed tuned to density. Humanity's instinct in crisis was to cluster together, and the harrows turned that instinct against them. Thomas, who had spent 14 months learning to be alone in a crowd, took Mandy through the back streets. They found a group sheltering in a community center off the Pershore Road. 30-odd people, a mix of families and stragglers, and 3 soldiers who'd become separated from their unit. The soldiers were arguing in low, tense voices about what the standing orders were now that standing orders had effectively ceased to exist. Thomas listened from the doorway. He recognized the particular quality of that argument. The one where everyone is right, and everyone is wrong, and the thing they're actually arguing about is fear. He walked into the room. "I'm Thomas Dunn," he said. "I'm a psychiatrist. I don't know how to fight. But I know what the diminishment does to people, and I know how to keep people functional when their minds are telling them to shut down. And right now that might be more useful than firepower. So if you'll let me help, I'd like to start." There was a silence. Then one of the soldiers, a woman, late 20s, the rank tab said corporal. The face said she hadn't slept since yesterday. Said, "Can you help my sergeant? He hasn't spoken since the contact." Thomas crossed the room and knelt beside the sergeant, a broad man in his 50s, sitting very still with his hands flat on his thighs. Thomas had seen this before, the shutdown, the way extreme psychological input sometimes caused the mind to simply lock its own doors. He didn't touch the man. He just sat beside him on the cold floor, close enough to be felt, and waited. The way he'd waited with his worst patients. The way he'd sat beside Mandy in the hallway. After a minute, the sergeant said quietly, "It told me we don't matter." "I know," Thomas said. "You felt it too?" Everyone felt it. The sergeant looked at him for the first time. "And you're still walking around." "I had practice," Thomas said, feeling like I didn't matter, and getting up anyway. The sergeant's name was Hargreaves. He became the backbone of what they started calling, without any official designation, the group. 2 people, 1 psychiatrist, 3 soldiers, a community center with 6 weeks of tinned food if they were careful, and no clear plan beyond surviving the next 24 hours, and then the 24 after that. Thomas was not in command. He never framed it as being in command. He was, as he explained to Corporal Vasquez when she asked, just trying to keep people at the functional end of the spectrum. The Harrows operated in pulses. 40 minutes of bombardment, 20 of stillness. Like breathing. The stillness was almost worse than the bombardment. During the bombardment, you had something to react to. During the stillness, you had nothing to do but wait and think. And thinking, for most people in those first weeks, was the enemy. Thomas ran what he privately thought of as surgery. Not on bodies. On the moments when the stillness broke people. He moved through the group during the quiet periods, checking in, asking small questions, keeping the conversational engine turning. He caught 2 people on the edge of going out into the street. He talked 1 soldier through a panic response, so severe her hands had stopped working. He organized routines, meals at specific times, sleep rotations, small assigned tasks. Not because the tasks were necessary, but because purpose was the first thing the diminishment stole, and routine was the fastest way to give it back. Mandy, 16 weeks along now, taught the children arithmetic games. This was not a small thing. The 3 children in the group, who had experienced the diminishment as a kind of profound wrongness they couldn't articulate, began organizing easing their fear into something manageable whenever they were doing long multiplication. Thomas watched his wife do this and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt since before Rebecca, a thing he'd forgotten, had a name. 5 weeks in, they made contact with other groups via a salvaged radio. The picture that emerged was enormous and strange. The Harrows were not, as it turned out, simply destroying Earth. They were sorting it. The diminishment had been a classification system, a way of identifying, neurologically, which human beings had certain markers. Nobody could identify the markers precisely, but the pattern that emerged from survivor reports was becoming clear. The groups that had organized. The groups that had maintained function under extreme psychological pressure. The groups where people had, against the weight of the diminishment, chosen to treat each other as significant. The Harrows were not taking samples from the chaos. They were, apparently, not interested in the chaos at all. They were watching something else. Thomas spent 3 nights with this information, turning it over. He thought about what the diminishment had told him. Not the message. The specific neurological signature of it. He was a psychiatrist. He had spent his career reading the emotional content behind stated content, the thing beneath the thing, and there had been something in the diminishment beyond insignificance. There had been almost too faint to register. Something that felt like a question. He brought it to Hargreaves in the small hours of the 6th week. Came here to find something, Thomas said. Resources, Hargreaves said. Territory. Standard invasion logic. They transmitted directly into every human brain simultaneously on day 1. Not a weapon, a probe. They've been watching us since. He laid out the survivor group data. Pattern of which settlements had been left alone. Which had been targeted. They're running a selection. I think they want to know if we can stay human under conditions designed to strip that away. Hargreaves looked at the maps for a long time. Why? I don't know. But I think we've been answering the question, whether we knew we were answering it or not. They began carefully to send signals, not military signals. Thomas was explicit about this, with Vasquez, who wanted to broadcast coordinates of the Harrow landing sites to whatever military assets remained. Not yet, he said. If I'm right, an aggressive signal reads as a failed test. It reads as exactly the response they've already seen 1,000 times from 1,000 species. And if you're wrong, Vasquez said, then we've lost nothing we haven't already lost. What they broadcast instead was mundane and strange. recordings of Mandy's maths games with the children, a conversation about what everyone missed most from before. Sergeant Hargreaves, who turned out to have a good voice, reading aloud from a paperback thriller he'd found in the community center kitchen. Thomas himself late one night, talking about Rebecca, not the grief, just the facts of her, who she was, what she had liked, the particular way she had laughed. His voice only broke once. He kept going. The Harrow above Birmingham went quiet on a Tuesday morning. Not gone, quiet. The bombardment pulse stopped and didn't resume. By Thursday, every Harrow station in a 30-kilometer radius had powered down to something that looked, on the salvaged sensors, like a listening posture. Psst. Thomas stood on the community center roof, with Mandy and Hargreaves and Vasquez, and watched the enormous thing hanging in the sky above them, its curve catching the winter light, and nobody said anything for a long time. The second transmission came at dawn on Friday. It was longer than the diminishment, much longer, and where the diminishment had been a statement, a cold assessment, a verdict. This was different in character. This was structured like a question. Thomas couldn't understand it. No human could, but he felt its shape. He had spent his career learning to feel the shape of what people were really asking beneath what they said, and what this felt like was, "We did not expect this. Tell us more." He didn't pause. He walked to the radio and he started talking. He talked about Rebecca, about the first time he'd held her, how impossibly light she was, how certain he'd been in that moment that he would do absolutely anything. He talked about the 14 months of silence after. The way grief had the particular quality of being both enormous and invisible, present in every ordinary moment. He talked about the morning Mandy had shown him the test strip, how he'd tried to laugh and nearly cried instead. He talked about the community center, and Hargreaves and Vasquez and the children doing sums, and old Arthur Mack, who he'd seen in his bathrobe on the driveway and who had turned out, 3 weeks in, to be a retired paramedic with extremely useful skills. He talked about the specific way humans broke and the more specific way they didn't. And he talked about how the thing the diminishment had called insignificance was also, from the inside, the thing that made significance possible. That you couldn't know what mattered, if everything mattered. From spores was the precondition of love. He ran out of words eventually. He sat back and waited. The Harrow above Birmingham did not move for 11 hours. Then it rose, slowly, with a sound like the world exhaling. And as it rose, the others rose too, rippling outward across the British Isles, across Europe, signals coming in from every surviving settlement radio. They're lifting. They're all lifting. And Thomas sat in the small, cold room, surrounded by 32 people, and thought about his daughter, and about the child who was coming, and about what it meant to be a species that could be broken open by 4 seconds of contact, and still, in the rubble of itself, find things worth saying. Vasquez was crying. She would have been mortified if he'd pointed it out, so he didn't. Hargreaves said quietly, "Think they'll come back?" "Maybe," Thomas said. "I think they heard something they'll need to think about for a while." He went to find Mandy. She was in the room with the children sitting cross-legged on the floor, while the youngest one, a girl of 6 named Priya, explained something to her, using her fingers for counting. Mandy looked up when he came in. The light through the window was pale and clear. She had her hand on her stomach in the way she'd started doing recently, the unconscious gesture, and when she saw his face, she knew. "They're going," he said. She reached up, and he took her hand and stood there in the light. And from outside came the sound of people coming out of doors, the first voices in weeks that weren't scared. And somewhere down the street someone was, incredibly, laughing. The real kind. Thomas closed his eyes. He held his wife's hand. He breathed. Outside, the sky was just the sky.